What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video I'm going to be ranking the dungeons from easiest to hardest to solo flawless. For a bit of background, ever since the start of 2022 I've been making guides on how to solo flawless the dungeons with updated strategies and using the current artifact to its full advantage. I don't know how many dungeons I've solo flawlessed, but it's well over 50. I've done all but the latest 2 on every character, and I've done them with a variety of builds and loadouts. In my Vesper's host guide a while back, I said it was the hardest dungeon to solo flawless, and I laid out the reasons for this. And then in the comments, I had many people saying this or that is harder, so in this video, I'm going to be ranking every dungeon on how hard it is to solo flawless and giving my reasons for the rankings. Obviously, this is subjective, as what one person finds hard, another person may find easy, but I feel my reasoning on Vesper's host is sound, as I give tangible ways in which the encounter design makes it a tough solo flawless. So without further ado, let's jump into it. For the easiest dungeon to solo flawless, I'm giving that to Pit of Heresy. This was the first dungeon I ever solo flawlessed, and I did it back in the day when it was actually challenging. I also soloed Shattered Throne shortly after doing this one when the same boxes were the same, and Shattered was definitely more difficult in my opinion. Pit of Heresy has a few difficult things to get past, but these have all been made drastically easier thanks to power creep. The opening section is extremely easy, you just have to kill a Shrieker, Wizard, and Knight, which is something that has gotten far easier to do now with how strong our Guardians are with things like DR and Restoration. Then you have the maze. This was difficult back in the day, but now you can mow through the adds in no time in the caves, and then eager edge past the ogres or use invis if you want. Rely on a glaive or some other form of damage resist. The ogres used to be quite difficult back in the day because they could melt you, but with better movement and damage resistance thanks to 100 resilience, this is no longer much of a challenge. Totems used to be unforgiving as you had to deal with countless adds and then have to take out beefy knights up top and pick up the orb and get back in time before the totem exploded and wiped you. Izanagi's Burden was great for one-shotting them back in the day, and Devour was almost needed to survive this room. But again, with easy access to Resto and Devour, damage resistance, and huge power creep to take out the knights in a myriad of ways, you can breeze through this encounter. Incidentally, the hardest part of the solo flawless is the jumping puzzle that follows. Jumping past the spike traps and then hitting your jumps in the Harrow takes a bit of practice. One wrong move and you will fall to your death. And despite beating this dungeon over 200 times, I still don't really know my way around here. But if you can hit all your jumps and make it to the boss room, then you're chilling. The boss fight is a quick and easy 2-phase with just the Cursed Thrall and the boss's fire attack to worry about, but with some good movement, this should be no problem. It's also pretty easy to 1-phase, but yeah, 2-phase is very forgiving. Pit of Heresy was designed around a vastly different sandbox, and as a result, it, in my opinion, is the easiest solo flawless. Next is Shattered Throne. Much like Pit, it suffers from being designed over half a decade ago when the game was completely different. The opening encounter is stupid easy now as the mini-bosses just fall over. Taking out the ogres on the jumping platform is also very easy now. Hitting your jumps can still be a bit of a challenge, but overall it's not very difficult. The Thrallway used to be very tough because you could not sprint and you could not regenerate your health. But now we have so many ways to get health back, from knockout to devour to restoration. Hell, even a heal clip weapon will help you waltz through this area with ease, not to mention eager skating. The first boss used to be so tough. I struggled like hell with the ogre boss. You had to deal with immunity goblins and tanky and dangerous wizards. Plus, match game was a thing back then, so I remember running a Void inaugural address to take out the wizard's Void shield. But again, power creep has gotten us to a point where we can basically one-shot them with a mini hammer that we can throw every 2 seconds. So it is far from threatening at this point. And then the ogre boss pretty much falls over these days, so it's an easy 1-phase. From here you have a long traversal, which is pretty easy after you run it a few times. The most dangerous part in my opinion is the boop wall. You could use an eager edge sword if you wanted to be safe, or a grapple grenade, but using a sword is a bad idea because this is the one dungeon without rally flags. Since you can't rally, you need a bit of foresight and to run a build that will allow you to have ammo for the final boss. The final boss used to be tough too, as you had to deal with scions before they multiplied. But you could take out basically all the scions and 3 knights with a couple consecrations in today's sandbox. Back in the day, you had to rely on strategy and movement to whittle them all down so that they would die at the same time so that you could pick up the finite thought buff for its full duration to take out Dullankaru. But now you can take the knights down extremely easily, making the boss fight pretty much a joke. And it too is an easy 1-phase, so you barely even have to know about the mechanic of cleansing yourself on the plate and getting ready for a second round. Once again, thanks to power creep, this dungeon has become very easy. My next easiest dungeon may surprise you, but it is Spire the Watcher. The opening encounter is pretty free, and if you die it's no big deal to just reset. You can avoid connecting wires fully to keep supplicants from spawning in, and just rely on cover and movement to avoid the Cyclops blasts. Once you learn the order and pathing of how to shoot the nodes, this becomes very easy. The first traversal can definitely be a challenge, but once again, if you wipe here, it's not a huge deal. Eager Edge helps massively, and if you can Eager Skate, you can basically skip it all. Warlocks have Well, Hunters have Shatter Skating, and Titans can do Lion Rampants, so all three classes can do this easily. The first encounter is a joke, and you can basically avoid all combat and just connect the dots. Then you have the Harpy boss. The enemies in here are super non-threatening, so the only real issue is having to 3-phase the boss. But again, when you learn the order to shoot the nodes, you can get to damage very quickly. The toughest part of this dungeon is next, with the traversal section with some spinning fan blades that can kill you, but this is pretty easy to get past, all things considered. Then you get to the bottom where you have to shoot 5 nodes. This can be tough to do solo, but it is not like you wipe if you don't get it, so just keep trying. Then you have the boss room, again a fight that can be sped up tremendously when you know where the nodes are to shoot. Supplicants are easy to avoid by just baiting them into exploding and jumping away, and the boss is easy to kite back and forth, it just takes a bit of practice. What I love about this dungeon is there is a mechanical skill gap which, when solved, can massively speed up the dungeon. I wish more dungeons had mechanics like this, where you could speed up the process as you get better at it. My first solo flawless clear was 2 hours, which is my longest clear by far, but I did it on my first try. And it was on the day it came out, so it tells you how relatively easy it was if you were just safe and took your time. But now I can do this dungeon in about 40 minutes pretty easily, and that is without being hyper optimized. But as far as deadly mechanics go, there really aren't any. There's no timer that can wipe you, no urgency, you can just go at your own pace. This makes it very easy from a mechanic perspective, which is why I rate it so easy to solo flawless. The only things that will kill you are potentially a jumping puzzle and the boss if you get lazy and complacent and don't avoid its slow moving projectiles. And I guess I should also mention the exploding supplicants, which can kill you. But that's pretty much it. It's a very easy solo flawless. Next I would have to say is Grasp of Avarice. One of the biggest threats here is all the goofy traps. The barrel coming down, stepping on the wrong plates. These will surely get you a few times if you are new to it, but once you get the locations of them down, they're very easy to avoid. You can also just eager or strand past the whole part of the dungeon that used to have traps and close quarters enemies, so this has made it much easier. The first boss used to be pretty tough. He hits like a truck, and even the knights in the side rooms could be dangerous. But when you collect 10 engrams, you get a super, so you can leverage this fact to clear the rooms quickly and safely. These engrams do have an unforgiving timer though, as if you don't collect a new one fast enough to refresh the buff, you will wipe to Burden of Riches. This timer must be managed or you will die, so this definitely adds some urgency. There are also Thrall to deal with leading up to damage, but you can manipulate the spawn. So basically let them spawn and then start dunking your engrams. You can kill them all before damage to make damage easy, as it's just you and the boss. Also hang on to the Scorch Cannon so that you don't spawn in Fallen that will shoot you during damage. These subtle tricks make soloing it so much easier, but if you don't know about them, then they can be a challenge to deal with. The Ogre can be pretty reliably two-phased in today's day and age, so you have much less of a chance of dying here than you did in the past. The Sparrow part can definitely be a hang-up for people, but once you learn a route to follow, it isn't too bad. But I am sure lots of runs end here because even to this day, it can be challenging if you aren't focused. The Servitor boss is probably my least favorite encounter in any dungeon. Doing 4 of anything just sucks. It should have been 3. Ghost of the Deep's opening encounter suffers from the same problem. I just hate it. So anyways, while this encounter may not actually be that long, it is so boring and stupid that it feels like it takes forever. I despise it, it just sucks. But there is no difficulty here. You may just die from a lapse of focus thanks to boredom, which is something that Ghost of the Deep suffers from hugely. So anyways, after this awful encounter, we have the final boss. Much like Spire, the lead up to damage can be sped up greatly with practice and proficiency, and I love that that's the case. Having a skill gap to mechanics is amazing for solo players. Then boss damage occurs, and this is a comfortable 3-phase, which is kind of the sweet spot for a solo dungeon in my opinion. The boss Shank and Vandal that spawn used to be incredibly tanky, but thanks to power creep, we can deal with them much quicker nowadays. And again, you can leverage the 10 engram to get a super rule to abuse your super and take them out. But this also comes with a risk. You either have to deposit the engrams and then remember how many you deposited, or use your super and then pick more up quickly so you don't wipe to the timer. The engram timer can definitely get you, but with practice it is fairly easy to work around. Damage can be difficult too if you don't set it up properly. If you have a bunch of ads left up, they will hurt you during damage, but you can't spend forever taking them out either, as you will die to the timer. Also, you have to watch out for the water when collecting engrams, but that is a stupid mistake on your part rather than the game's fault. Trust me, I've died to it too, but it is your own fault. Just leave those engrams. Overall though, it's a pretty chill solo flawless that gets a lot easier when you learn to set up your damage phases and play around the timer and use the 10 engrams to spam your super. Next is Prophecy. This is a wonderful dungeon and holds up so well for its age. First boss, the Echo Phalanx, can still be a challenge. The boss can boop you to your death, the knights can still go Super Saiyan and mess you up, scions can multiply out of control if you don't stay on top of things, and damage phase can be quite difficult still thanks to the immunity goblins. Overall, it's a very well designed boss encounter that can still prove challenging even if it does only take you 1 or 2 phases to beat. The Wasteland is very easy and chill these days and you should not be dying here. Cube Room is so much easier than it used to be. The hobgoblins used to hurt like a bitch and the knights were tanky. Now it's not too bad at all, just a little repetitive, and the bosses at the very end of the encounter just fall over. With the introduction of skimmers, Rainbow Road has been made much easier. This used to be somewhat threatening, but now it really isn't. The final boss also holds up pretty well. The lead up to damage used to be very dangerous. There was no real cover when all 3 echoes were in the corners, so you had to work quickly. But now, with power creep, you can tank a lot more damage and survive until you get 1 or 2 echoes down. Onto boss damage, this is the reason I put it above Grasp of Avarice. You need to have good movement here or you will die, and you need to know the boss's movement pattern. It isn't overly hard, but you do have to be focused. You also have to deal with the hobgoblins. They don't hit as hard as they used to, but they are still a threat. So you have to deal with damaging the boss, looking out for hobgoblins, hitting your jumps, and staying within distance of the boss so you don't wipe to Dark Entropy. I have beat this dungeon over 100 times, so it's pretty old hat to me, but to someone more unfamiliar with the dungeon, I can see how this boss damage phase could still be a difficult one. Prophecy is such a great dungeon to this day and still has the best solo flawless emblem. So that's it for the quote-unquote easy dungeons in my opinion. The ones where you could solo flawless them not too bad even if you're a new player. And now we get to the harder dungeons. The first one is actually Destiny's latest dungeon, Sundered Doctrine. This dungeon has no real sense of urgency throughout the whole thing. No mechanics can really kill you, so you can take your time and take everything at your own pace. Sure, it may take you 2 hours if you're super slow, but there is no time crunch that is a threat. The opening encounter is as easy as it is boring. You run from room to room, killing enemies and getting lenses and taking note of the symbols. If you know the lore, you can actually predict the truth that will go on the wheel in the main area, and this is a strat that speedrunners use. But if you don't practice it like crazy, then this opening encounter will probably take you between 15 and 20 minutes, and in my opinion, it's super boring. I know I praised other dungeons for having mechanical skill gaps as well, and this one does technically have that, as the best players in the world have memorized the truths and the optimal lens placements, but the average person is not going to overcome this mechanical skill gap like they would with something like Spire the Watcher, where it's just knowing all the static node placements. This one is dynamic. It's an ever-changing encounter, so you can't just memorize it because it's always changing. This is the difference with the mechanics in this dungeon versus others, and for me, personally, I don't like this. But once you're finally done this encounter, you have a traversal. The traversals throughout are not too threatening either. The Indiana Jones boulders are very cool, but not a place where you are likely to die. Or before the boss room, you do have the part where you have to move lenses, but again, this isn't too scary at all. The Zoetic lock set is the second encounter, and this is by far the hardest part of the dungeon. New strats and techniques are always being found, and I think at this point it's not too difficult to overcome. Arc Titan is busted in episode Heresy, but in the future I still don't think this encounter will be too bad. As of the making of this video, a lot of things do not work on this boss, and that's a shame. But if they do get corrected, it could open up even more build options. Time will tell. The final boss is also not too difficult, having mechanics that are quite forgiving like I mentioned. The biggest threat of death is honestly the door that you have to shoot open. Outside of that, just avoid the boss and don't get caught in the slow and you're fine. The boss is quite tanky though, but it should be a routine and consistent 5 phase with a variety of safe damage options, which isn't too bad. Overall, nothing is imminently dangerous, so if you go slow and play cautious, you should be able to beat this one fairly easy. Next up is Duality. This came out in Season of the Haunted and Classy Restoration was damn near a must. It was the first dungeon designed around 3.0 subclasses, as Void and Solar 3.0 were in the game at this point, and as a result you had a barrage of enemies on the final boss. But first, let's look at the beginning of the dungeon. The opening traversal is not too bad, and then you have the Nightmare of Galron as the first encounter. This is a pretty tough fight. Solo, it takes a lot longer to get to damage, which can be annoying and feel like it takes forever, and then the boss damage phase is pretty unforgiving. The timer starts when you TP, so taking out the Shades of Galron quickly is a must. The longer you take here, the less time you have to deal damage. As such, you need a loadout that can take them out quickly, but also something that has good damage for the boss. There are lots of Cabal enemies up during damage that will hurt you, and the boss moves around a ton and is unpredictable. The unpredictability adds to the difficulty, and then you have to ride the fine line of maximizing your damage by going on as long as you can, but not too long or you will wipe if you don't make it back to the bell in time due to Nightmare collapsing. This timing definitely takes a little practice to get used to, but if you're going for solo flawless, always leave a little early if you have to. It's better to be safe than sorry. Hopefully you can 3-phase the boss here and then you're onto the vault. The traversal here can be tricky, so you have to be careful, but overall it isn't too bad. In vault, you again are working against the Nightmare collapsing timer. You have to be quick here. Ariana's Vow helps a ton here, and thanks to our ability spam based builds, it is much easier to run Ariana's and an Eager Edge sword to help for movement than it used to be. You just need a weapon loadout that could deal the good boss damage, because the mini bosses were tanky. But now you can just rely more on abilities to take them out and your loadout to be optimized for movement and running the Nightmare area quickly. But back in the day, this was a trade-off and made this encounter much more difficult. It can still be a bit of a challenge, but taking the enemies out quickly and getting back to the bell isn't too bad now with some practice and optimization. After the vault, we have another traversal which definitely has a few spots where you could die, and then we're on to the Keitel fight. The lead up to damage is pretty hectic, but not too bad if you have access to healing. There's basically no cover, so you need an ad slaying build. When you get transported, you have to kill the right scions or you basically wipe. This is unforgiving and requires you to pay attention and know where the symbols are. This is a very unforgiving mechanic that can definitely cause a wipe. But then when you get to damage, you have scions shooting at you and the Incendiors that you need to delete quickly. It is good to snipe their backpack to blow it up or use a fusion rifle to disintegrate them. Over the years, I've seen lots of people complaining about backpacks blowing up. Yes, it has killed me too, but it is also a skill issue. You can shoot the backpacks on the ground in that room before going back for damage. Housekeeping is crucial here. If you want to solo flawless, take the time to do it. This isn't some random thing killing you, it can be controlled and you only have yourself to blame. Then during damage, like I said, you have scions shooting at you. When you enter the room for damage, you have many balls to juggle at once and quickly. Identify where Keitel is going, kill the backpacks, stun Keitel before she reaches the bell, avoid and or kill the scions. This is pretty unforgiving to this day, and as a result makes Duality stand up as one of the harder dungeons to solo flawless. You rinse and repeat all this 2 or 3 times and you're good. Next for me is Warlord's Ruin, which is probably my favorite dungeon in the game. It's just awesome. The first encounter is extremely fast paced, and unless you build for it, you probably won't have a super for your second damage phase. You need a build that can take enemies out quickly and deal good boss damage. The Score and Lurker shields are also very annoying, and anti-barrier weapons help a lot here. You have to shoot the Acolyte eyes from the cages or you will wipe. And then you have to capture the totems while under threat of all the Scorn and the boss. You must be quick or you won't get both totems claimed, so your boss damage phase will be shorter. Then rinse and repeat this around 4 times and you will beat this boss. You need high burst DPS loadouts to take the boss out quickly, as damage phases are quite short. And you need something like Devour or Restoration to survive all the attacks. It isn't too bad, but without a good build, it will be very difficult. Then we have the Traversal. This part isn't too bad, but you do need to remember where all the traps are or you will die. This just takes practice and familiarity. The second boss is a very long damage phase, where again you need a loadout with a way to get health back as there are tons of enemies. You need something to take the Scorn bosses out quickly, and you have to pay attention to your biting cold timer or you will die. Forgetting about this timer will result in a wipe, so you have to be aware. There are also Scorn snipers that hurt like a bitch. Make sure you take them out before starting damage. Ad management before damage is crucial. During damage, the boss likes to push you. I've blown myself up with a Dragon's Breath rocket more times than I like to admit. But again, this is my fault for being too aggressive or using that weapon when I know it has a delayed explosion. You have to balance boss damage with taking out ads, and you need a good loadout with total damage and sustained DPS. Rinse and repeat a few times and you will be good. The next traversal is actually the traversal that I find the hardest out of any of the dungeons. You have the spinning rocks and you also have pitfall traps that you have to remember. I'm pretty good with it now, but it took me a lot of practice to find a path that I'm comfortable with. It is good to take out the wizards and snipers from a distance so that you can move freely. Then you have to be sure of your jumps and also avoid the spinning rocks. After this, right before the boss arena, you have a ton of ads to take out. You have Booper taking phalanxes that can kill you if you aren't careful, and where all the ads are, the boss is also hanging out shooting his Void Eye Blast. This can be very dangerous if you aren't ready, so have all your abilities in your super here and you'll be able to take them out fairly easily. But you do have to be prepared. Onto the boss fight, there's a lot going on. You have tons of taken Scions and taken Miasma on the floor that you have to deal with. Stay on top of all this stuff as it will take your health down and prevent you from regenning. Also, you want to spawn kill the wizards or they will become a problem. They really hurt, and so does the boss. Again, a way to get health back is basically required. The Scorn Totem dudes are very tanky, so take them out as fast as you can. The totem spawns are also wildly inconsistent, which is a huge design flaw of the dungeon and adds to the frustration. Bungie really needs to fix this. But anyways, as soon as they spawn a totem, you want to take them out so that you can capture 2 totems at once. Ads will be shooting at you and the corrupted Hex Drinker will be hitting you. You have to punch it before the Hex of Vengeful Corruption timer expires. A lot of people have complained about this, but again, it's a skill issue. You punch him with a few seconds remaining, and if he hits you back, you still have time to punch again. Then just make sure you don't have the debuff anymore, and then just run away until he despawns. He despawns with 5 seconds of Imminent Wish left, and that is when you get ready for damage. And right when damage starts, a bunch of Scions spawn in. Sadly, you can't deal with them prior to, so this is just something that you have to work around. Either take them out right away and then deal damage, or do a bunch of damage and then kill them. Regardless, with a good build, they shouldn't be much of an issue. Then you rinse and repeat this a number of times until you push to final stand. The final stand here is also quite dangerous as the boss hurts a lot and there's miasma on the ground. Try and have heavy and a super for this part to melt the boss quickly. Overall, it's a pretty tough boss fight, but I think it's very fair. Warlord's Ruin is a very well balanced dungeon. Next is Ghost of the Deep, my least favorite dungeon to solo. It starts off with having to cleanse 4 runes. This needs to be 3. Being 4 makes this encounter needlessly drag on, which is a theme of this godforsaken dungeon. So you run around the map killing enemies over and over until you cleanse 4 runes. It's very boring, but not overly difficult. Next, we have the most boring traversal in the entirety of Destiny 2. You fall for an eternity deeper and deeper, going through water that slows you. There are a bunch of enemies, but you can eager past all of them. It's just extremely boring. Yes, I suppose you could die to needing an oxygen bubble, but overall, it's quite easy to avoid this. You can run high mobility to help your underwater speed and just play safe and know where the bubbles are. It's not hard, it's just boring. Then you get to the first boss. This boss is designed very well. As with Spire, it can be sped up a lot by knowing what you are doing. Take out the 3 knights as soon as possible, which spawns in the ogre, and then just delete it, and then get deep sight to see your symbols. Then jump down and hit the symbols. When you learn where these all are, this can be done quite quickly, but your rune RNG does play a bit of a factor. Yes, you have to watch out for the boss and could potentially die due to lack of oxygen, but overall, this part isn't too bad when you're familiar with the fight. Before you know it, you can be back up top taking out the wizards. Once you crush the ghosts of the first wizard, you have a 1 and 20-second timer for Vestige of Light. This means you have to dunk before the timer is up. This is another timer that can kill you that you must be wary of, but it's pretty forgiving. So you take out the 3 wizards and dunk the vestiges. As soon as the third is dunked, damage is going to be starting. You have to be quick and take out the knight to spawn the green pool so that you can take out the boss's overshield. This is the worst mechanic Bungie has ever put into a dungeon. Yes, worse than the underwater traversal. Yes, even worse than the servitor encounter in Grasp of Avarice. The overshield is tanky, and as a solo, it's very annoying to deal with. In a fire team, one person can just run Arbalest to take it out, but as a solo, you either run Arby and your DPS suffers, or you front load damage with a super or parasite or something just to take it down and then deal damage. Legend of Avarice is great here as well. While doing damage, you constantly have ads attacking you, so you need a good survivability build. You can also use them to your advantage to proc certain perks like Combination Blow. But regardless, you have to juggle many things during damage, and it is one of the more threatening damage phases in any dungeon, so it can definitely be difficult. But for me, the worst part about it is the overshield. Once you kill the boss and crush its ghost, we have a much more reasonably length traversal. It's funny because Vesper's Host and Warlord's Ruin also have long traversals, but they don't feel long. The first traversal in Ghost just feels horrible. So anyways, we do a quick traversal to the boss, which can be dangerous with the Shriekers and the Knights and the Wizards that spawn in behind you. I've definitely died here in the past, but just be slow and cautious and you'll be fine. So now we get to the final boss. Again, this feels like such a long, boring chore to get to damage. I just hate it. You have to kill the Knights in the green pool to line up the symbols, and once you do this, moths will spawn. Again, people often complain about dying to moths like they are random and come out of nowhere. They don't. This is a skill issue, you're just not paying attention. That being said, after trudging through this bore of a dungeon, I can't blame anyone for losing focus and forgetting to shoot the moths, but it's still on you if you die to them. So once you line up 3 symbols, now you go and kill a Lucent Hive in each area and dunk the symbol. This can definitely be dangerous. The Hive Knight with his shield throw hits very hard, and you have to take note of the symbol before you crush the ghost. If you don't and you dunk the symbol on the wrong spot, you will die. This is a very unforgiving instant wipe mechanic, so this definitely adds to the difficulty. And you have to run through the water to get to these guys, and run a long way back, making an already long and boring fight even worse. So now you finally go and dunk the 3rd one and start damage, and again you have an overshield to deal with. And ads spawn in once you dunk this last vestige. So you have to take out the overshield as quickly as possible and deal with the ads and deal damage. So damage phases can be pretty inconsistent if you get unlucky. Also, in the lead up to damage, when you go to dunk the vestiges, you have to get deep sight, and this is another spot that can be quite dangerous because the animation makes you stand there and the boss is sometimes peppering you with its arc attack. So it forces you to go somewhere dangerous and out of cover to complete the mechanic. This is definitely another area where you can die if you don't do it properly. So say you do all this crap and get through a successful damage phase. Well, you're looking at doing it about 4 times to kill the boss, which is really annoying. I just hate this boss fight. It's a war of attrition more than being difficult. It's super boring and unengaging, and when you aren't engaged, you will have lapses in judgment. And this is why I rank it as the number 2 hardest solo flawless dungeon in Destiny. So that brings us to the hardest dungeon to solo flawless, and that is Vesper's Host. I made a whole video talking about why it's the toughest solo in the game, and I referenced those mechanics and reasons in the video. One is an unforgiving timer with the augment buff. If you forget to dunk it, you die. Shoot the wrong panel in any encounter, instant death. These are very unforgiving mechanics that can instantly kill a solo flawless. But then you have other challenging areas. Like most recent dungeons, it has huge ad density that definitely requires some form of healing. The servitor boss has exploder shanks which can sometimes get up on you very quickly, and they can also kill you from a pretty generous distance, so they can definitely be a threat. Grabbing the suppressor buff after using it on the boss can sometimes get you killed, so you have to be wary. And Rainix has been adjusted now to only have 6 servitors, meaning you will take numerous more phases than you used to because the geniuses at Bungie didn't adjust the health pool when they reworked the boss so that tether could be re-enabled. Just an extremely lazy fix. Regardless, it means more phases, which means more monotony, causing you to potentially slip up, and more chances at an untimely death. Then you have a long traversal section with some pretty dangerous enemies, so you have to bring high damage output. The lightning strikes can also kill you on the traversal if you jump at the wrong time, so you have to stay focused. There's also trip mines that can explode and kill you, so there's just a lot of ways to die here. And then you finally get to the final boss. The radiation puppets can be dangerous, especially in the rooms where you dunk the cores. The red room has very little cover, leaving you exposed, and if you get bad scanner RNG, you may die. And sometimes you get like 3 puppets in that room pushing you and giving you radiation. You have a timer as well where you have to dunk the core in 44 seconds or it wipes you. Running the hallways with the tripwires, sometimes radiation puppets will be in there, but not always. The randomness makes things more difficult than dungeons in the past where everything is quite predictable. This is the biggest challenge for what makes this dungeon so tricky. You have to read and react. And nothing is more random than the boss room thanks to the lightning strikes. Yes, there are cheese spots to avoid the floor, but if you play it like it's intended, then this can be rather difficult. You have to deal with the boss type enemies, which is way harder than the Thrall and Ghost of the Deep during damage, or the Scions and Warlord's Ruin. These boss enemies actually pose a threat and need to be managed and dealt with, all while avoiding one-shot mechanics from the lightning strikes. This is by far the most hectic and unforgiving boss in the game, including raid bosses. So on the boss fight alone, this makes it the most difficult. If you are good at adjusting on the fly, then it may not seem too hard to you, but as I said, this is not something that we are very used to in Destiny, so it adds a new dimension of unpredictability that most dungeons don't have. I told you in this video how to avoid many of the potential deaths in the other dungeons, but in this one, if you make one wrong move during the boss fight, it can easily be game over. Where in all the other boss fights, you can usually just halt damage to play your life. Yes, you will add a phase to the clear, but you won't die. In this, it just takes one slip up for it to all go up in flames, and the mechanics leading up to damage can also be unforgiving. So while the first 2/3 of this dungeon aren't that hard at all, the boss fight being as difficult as it is definitely raises the stakes. People have managed to get 2 phases and consistent 3 phases while solo, so even though the boss has a huge health pool, with optimizations, you can certainly speed things up. But again, to do that, you need to master the mechanics of the boss room, and they are the toughest mechanics we've had to face in Destiny to date. Alright, let's recap in order from easiest to hardest. The easiest dungeon of Solo Flawless is Pit of Heresy, then Shattered Throne, next is Spire the Watcher, at 4 we have Grasp of Avarice, 5 Prophecy, 6 Sundered Doctrine, 7 Duality, 8 Warlord's Ruin, 9 Ghosts of the Deep, and the hardest dungeon in Destiny 2 to Solo Flawless is Vesper's Host. Again, this is all subjective in my opinion, but for something like Sundered Doctrine, I feel the difficulty is the length and tedium more than the actual mechanics. And like I said, you can take your time a lot in Sundered. Anyways, let me know what you think is the hardest or easiest down below. Thanks for watching if you're still here. Leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care. Hey, if you're still here, then thanks so much for watching to the end. If you like what I do and you want to support me further, then consider becoming a channel member. You'll get your name featured on the end screen, custom badges, and other cool rewards. You can also join my community Discord if that interests you, and if you want to see me stream, be sure to follow me on Twitch at itstizzle7 where I stream semi-regularly. Those are linked in the description. Anyways, that's enough self-promotion. Thanks for watching. Take care.